Welcome back to Progressively Incorrect. I am your host, Dr. Zach Groshell, and this week I'm excited to share with you my interview with Jean Stockard from the Direct Instruction podcast. There are plenty of introductions in the actual recording, so I'll make this part quick. First, I am looking to establish more long-term relationships with schools so that the effective methods that feature on this podcast are actually being embedded into classrooms. You can find a brief overview of the professional development that I provide in the show notes and on my website, educationrickshaw.com. If you are ready for your school to take the plunge into the science of learning and effective teaching, consider having me over for training and consulting. Second, Progressively Incorrect is sponsored by John Catt Educational, which is the publisher of my forthcoming book and the purveyor of lots of great books on teaching and learning. This week, I wanted to highlight the Retrieval Practice series by Kate Jones. As listeners of this podcast will know, retrieval practice is a simple but powerful strategy in which bringing information to mind enhances learning. You can click the links in the show notes to choose between all 4 of Kate's books on retrieval practice, including Retrieval Practice Primary, a guide for primary teachers and leaders. Now, that's enough from me. I hope you enjoy this fantastic episode about 5 decades of research on DI with the excellent Jean Stockard. Hello, and welcome back to the Direct Instruction Podcast. My name is Dr. Zach Groshell, and today we have a fantastic episode about a half-century of research on the effectiveness of direct instruction with Jean Stockard. This episode is brought to you by NIFTY, or the National Institute of Direct Instruction. Registration is open for the National Direct Instruction Conference in Eugene, Oregon this summer. Whether you are new to direct instruction or are looking for training on administrative leadership, coaching, and becoming an effective DI trainer, this is the conference for you. I provided the links to register in the show notes, and I encourage you to sign up for what is the most comprehensive DI training available anywhere. One of the problems we face in education is that everybody claims that their program is research-based. These days, most curriculum publishing companies have to show some sort of proof that their program works if they are going to make states' lists of approved programs. The thing is, the determination that the program works is often made on the basis of the results of a single study. When you go over to the publisher's website and click past all the testimonials and flashy graphics, you find that the single study showed small, mixed, and often statistically insignificant effects. Because these studies often include intensive professional development workshops and additional resources for the teachers who receive the new program, it is questionable that students' learning gains can be attributed only to the use of the program and not to the teacher training that was employed or the extra resources that were provided. So I wanted to dig into the research base of direct instruction to see how it compares, and Jean Stockard seemed like the researcher I needed to talk to. Dr. Stockard is a distinguished quantitative sociologist and the author of the book, All Students Can Succeed. She and her colleagues are the authors of the 2016 meta-analysis on direct instruction curricula, which contained 328 studies involving 413 study designs and almost 4,000 effects. What I found interesting was that while the authors knew before they started the project that a lot of research had accumulated over the half century, they were stunned at the task that lay before them due to the sheer magnitude of research on DI. And when they went to crunch the numbers, the results were so strong and so consistent that they checked and rechecked their findings to make sure they were correct. No matter how they spliced it, they simply could not find any situation in which DI did not work. If you love the DI podcast, please help me spread it around and give it a 5-star rating on the platform of your choosing. And without further ado, let's go on over to Dr. Jean Stockard now. Hi, Jean. How are you doing?
Oh, very good. Thank you for having me.
So great to have you on the DI podcast. We're already into episode 3 of this new show, and I thought your voice was very important for our discussion here. But let's start here. How about you tell our audience, our listeners, about yourself?
I'm a sociologist, primarily quantitative. I taught at the University of Oregon for many, many years and specialized in a variety of things, often dealing with issues related to inequality, and taught a wide variety of areas, including some within sociology of education. And then when I got to the point of slowing down on teaching, I was asked to come to the National Institute for Direct Instruction and help them with analyzing data. They had a lot of data that on effectiveness and schools they'd helped through the years. And it was just sort of sitting there. And that's a little bit like a kid in a candy store for a quantitative sociologist. If you say, here are these data, try and make sense of them. And it turned out to be a great deal of fun and much more interesting than I ever thought it would be, because it was like discovering a gold mine in the extent to which the results were consistently positive. And it was so much so that I kept going back and redoing it and trying it again to see if there's some way I could be wrong. And then we realized that there was a lot that had been written over the years. And so we hired a graduate student from the university to come and go through the literature. And then from that, we gradually got to the point of saying, okay, we need to do a meta-analysis. We really need to pull this together. And that's what then ended up in the book you mentioned.
And so am I right that you weren't in primary schools teaching reading mastery, right? Like, so how did this, I mean, you had this data and I'm sure, you were contacted or talked to Nifty, but what made you say yes? Like, why were you interested in direct instruction in the first place?
I'm not sure that I was interested in direct instruction. I was just interested in this approach to learning and then also trying to understand, did it work? I mean, that's really what empirical social scientists do, is we try to answer questions. And I would have been just as interested if it turned out that it didn't work and that it was just a total farce. Because what we really want to do is we want to understand what's going on and what is happening. And so it was a puzzle. I know we're sort of these crazy nerds who are out there trying to figure out how the world works and especially how to make the world better. And that's one of the hallmarks, I believe, of social science is especially, well, I think really of all science. We want the world to be a better place. We want kids to do better. We want families to be happier. We want societies and communities to be more secure. And education is really key to that. And that's what it was really the motivating factor. And then I had no idea when I started out how powerful the program was. And I also didn't know much about it. I really had to learn about it as we went along.
You mentioned a few things there that, you're trying to make the world a better place, but there's a whole, I'm sure you know this because you're on the quantitative side of this. There's a lot of folks who don't who simply would, they want education to look a certain way, or they're not so interested in the results, or maybe they think even the tests themselves are indicative of something else. And maybe you could comment on some of those things.
Mm, I think I would distinguish people who are in sort of the philosophy of education from, or theories of education, from those of us who actually study the real life world and look at the data and say, what are the data coming, where are the data coming from? What are the data saying? And I think that's a big distinction. I was actually taken aback at how virulent the opposition was to structured learning, even though the whole approach is based very, very similar to what we know about cognitive psychology and how people make sense of the world. And so I was taken aback by the non-data based opinions that people have. I know I'm naive and I'm old enough that I shouldn't be that naive, but to have people simply not understand the data or reject it because of a belief system. And I think it's the people become very attached to belief systems. And so I think there's this incredible non-rational element within the education world, and very, very different from the world of quantitative social science.
Well, so, I've been saying on this show and in social media, right? Direct instruction is has been shown to be effective. And so you wrote the most current up to date meta analysis that is truthfully, I pass it to people all the time. When you so let's start with this. What do we know about the effectiveness of direct instruction?
Okay. Why don't I start by telling you what we did? Because what we did was we started out, there were these wonderful graduate students who worked with me through the years, finding these articles and so on. And we were going through and reading them and indexing them so they could be available to others. And then we realized we really needed to quantify the results. And so what we did was we went through each of these articles, and there's a way of translating the statistical results into something called an effect size, which says how powerful a result is, and is DI doing better than others. And we found well over 500 studies over a span of 50 years, and calculated over 4,000 effect sizes. And this is a massive amount of data. There's no indication that any other program has had that big of a body of literature. And then from this, we did two different kinds of statistical analyses. One was relatively simple, where we just looked in each study and we calculated what's the average effect here. And the other one was a more complex result, which involved what we call mixed model analyses, where we regress the effect sizes on characteristics of the study and of the comparison. And this is technically more accurate. The results were just very, very, very similar between the two. But the mixed model one allowed us to do all kinds of tests to figure out, is there any situation under which DI doesn't work? Is there some kind of sort of spot where other ones are better? And we absolutely could not find that. And I have to tell you, I did the run so many times and trying different ways to see if I could figure that something out where it didn't work. And I just couldn't find that. And the other thing that's really important, when we did the analysis with just the average results, there was only one study that had a result that was statistically significant in favor of the other program. But this study had a very small effect size. It was 0.13, and the criterion for being educationally significant is 0.25. So it was like half of what people would say this is important. So there literally was no study out there that said that it is better and was both statistically significant and substantively significant. Then the other thing, the magnitude of the effect of DI is incredible. There are these various benchmarks. And so this 0.25 is one that 50 years ago they said, oh, that's what we should see as being educationally important. And then you can look, some folks have looked at the averages across studies, and they found, well, it's around 0.25 is the average. They said they rarely get as high as 0.50. And for those who are into stats, this is a standard deviation. He said they really don't get that big. And if you ever do, that's just huge. Well, the average for DEI was 0.55. It was bigger than that. So, it really, we didn't put the word huge in our discussion, but it's what these other folks have said is huge. And so it really, really, the evidence was there, and it appeared across all the different kinds of settings, in different kinds of schools, in different geographic areas, with different kinds of studies, with different kinds of ways of measuring achievement. Just everywhere we looked at it over all the years, over the 50 years, we just could not find any situation in which it did worse.
Wow. Wow. And I have a lot of questions about the methodology and kind of digging in kind of, picking around the edges, because I think a lot of people don't realize when you do a study like this that you're going to be very explicit about the limitations. You're going to be very explicit about things we do not know. But let's talk about things that we do know. Like, maybe what are some of the highlights and perhaps some of the surprises that came out? Because I know you measured, it wasn't just effects on learning. There were other measures that were involved there as well.
Oh, excellent, excellent question. Yes, because there are data out there on things like student self-esteem and their interest in learning. And DI has a strong effect on that as well. And this is important for the people who say, oh, the reason students can't learn is that they have low self-esteem. So we have to do these programs to get their self-esteem up, then they can learn. That just, that doesn't fit logic, and it doesn't fit the data, because what happens is that kids learn, and then of course they feel good about it. And they think they're smart and they're successful, and they have proof to show they are. So that was a wonderful kind of finding. Oh, another really, really good one was long-term results. We had 500 of the 400 of the 4,000 effect sizes that involved times, what we call maintenance data, or data after the intervention stopped. And the average effect size there was like 0.48 or 0.43, something like that. It was over 0.4, and which is approaching what they call huge, and of course far greater than the average that we find with others. So the effect of studying with DI was long-term for these students. It wasn't just a flash in the pan. It really affected their entire career. And so that was also quite cool.
Excellent. And so I did realize, like, looking into this meta-analysis, that a lot of papers were excluded, but also you were intentional to try to, be absolutely thorough in including papers that perhaps, we know there's like a file drawer problem. There's papers that never see the light of day. So you're very thorough. What, maybe take us through kind of the inclusion or exclusion criteria you used?
Okay, yeah, another good question. We wanted to be as broad-based as possible. So what we did was we included as many studies as we possibly, we actually looked at every study where it was possible to calculate an effect size. So we didn't throw anything out at that level. So we kept everything in where we could calculate an effect size. And then it turned out that some had really big effect sizes, and it was more the ones that were just like super high. And so when we got to the analysis that is in articles and in the book, we took out those that were really out at the far extremes, and that's very common in this work. And then there were some that were really quite where there were problems. And so we took those out as well for the analysis in the book. But we did calculations with all of those included as well. So in the supplemental material, and I mentioned it in the book too, we have the results with those, and that did not really alter. What it did was it made the results a little bit stronger, but that's because there were so many out at the far positive end. So in fact, what we present in the book is a conservative estimate of the effect of DI. It's not that we sort of cherry picked. There's no way in the world we cherry picked. It's more that it would have been higher if we had left those in, but we didn't leave. We just thought it would be more accurate, and it would have what we call smaller standard error if we didn't have them in.
Perfect. Let's talk then about meta-analysis in general, because right now we've been sort of dropping things about how this works, and trying to be clear for all folks who may not know much about meta-analysis. But it often comes down that people will say about meta-analysis, right, this is like, garbage in, garbage out. Like, it's a tricky methodology to use, because you're sort of mushing things together, and really you can never really trust these effect sizes in some sense. I'm curious if you could comment on how this methodology does perhaps give us valuable information that can help us, make decisions and make the world a better place.
Okay. Yes, I think that if folks do have that concern, it's that the meta-analysis hasn't been totally, completely done or done in a way that tests all the possible ramifications or possible ways that might influence. So what we were able to do was we would, in the mixed model analyses, we would run tests essentially and say, what is the estimated effect if we have a research design that involved a pre-test, post-test rather than a norm control or rather than another design? And then we were able to see, does it make any difference? And then we would do another, we would also then, does it make any difference if the students are from a low income background or not? And we would then put these together. And so we have literally hundreds of tables where we looked at those results. And I think that if people would look at actual well-done meta-analyses where we use multivariate models and where we test multiple hypotheses, that conclusion doesn't hold. And in fact, a quantitative analysis of the literature is, I believe, much, much more accurate than any kind of narrative analysis where people can clearly pick and choose. And the other thing to add is that we explicitly tried to test to see why there were variations and why some had higher effects than others. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier, which I should have, was that two things actually made the effects even stronger. One was if students were exposed to DI for a longer period of time. And the second is the fidelity of the teachers, if the teachers did a good job in presenting the material and if they were trained and coached and if they'd had more experience. And the effects then were really quite high. And in fact, in the last chapter of the book, I do some simulations to show that the effects are strong enough that we could really begin to close the gap between children who come from low income households and other children. If you systematically implement it, these kids are going to do quite well.
And that's why it's so frustrating to me to hear this, right? Because DI has been around for more than 5 decades, and it's come and gone in some schools. It's gathering dust on some warehouses and in a lot, across the country, including places that I'm very familiar with. It just, right now we're in the middle of a big buzz around the science of reading. Perhaps this could be an answer that nobody's considering.
Of course. Yeah. It really is a shame. In the last chapter of the book, I also speculate about why that might happen. And I think people are making money. I'm coming across, this is my sociological bent, but I really think that part of it is self-interest. Textbook publishers make a lot of money. And then you have these researchers in education, supposed researchers, who say, we need to have a new curriculum to make it work. And so they'll get all of this money from the federal government to do some kind of new curriculum, when we know that there's one out there that works beautifully. And so far, they've not been able to make anything that is any better. And you have people who are also getting money to do tests. And so we're going to make another test to see why see if the kids aren't doing well, not even to help them do better, is to see if they're not doing well. So you have a lot of educational researchers making money. And so I think there's this incredible profit motive. And then there's also, I think, self-interest in terms of ego. And that you have people who are tied to their beliefs. So you have an education professor who's been talking for years about how teachers need to be creative in the classroom. Teachers need to get in touch with their inner selves. And when they're in touch with their inner selves, they will be better teachers. And they've been spouting this thing and writing about it for decades. And how could they say, oh, golly sakes, the data don't support that? So there's a lot of real self-interest there. And it's just, it's very hard to think that the educational community is going to reform itself. It's just, I think that they are making money off it. They're supporting their egos. A new superintendent comes into a school district and says, oh, I'm going to make everything better. Let's toss out this curriculum and go to something else. Again, it's just self-aggrandizement, and it's an absolute shame. just it's just and it's just awful that this would happen. And it's folks like you who can stick with education for so long. I so admire your guts. There's one point in the book where I say, I talk about that and I say we would be make most people would be in northern Manitoba growing rutabagas rather than trying to cope with these kinds of issues, because it's so daunting and so difficult, and then so sad. It's very sad.
Um, it definitely is. Maybe, I'm hoping this kind of conversation maybe gets a few people at least interested in in quantitative research, in methods that don't leave learning to chance, that are unambiguous and so on. I'm hoping this kind of inspires people. You did mention something I think is really important, and you wrote a paper recently. I'll read the title right off here. It was the impact of administrative decisions on implementation fidelity of direct instruction and student achievement. And so you talking about implementation fidelity, talking about leadership, right? I think this perfectly ties in. What do we know about, like, how leaders and implementation, those focused on implementation, like in my job, what do we know about what they can do to ensure that, like, these materials are actually used the way they were intended?
Oh, yeah, yeah. The person who's wrote the best stuff on this is Kurt Engelman, and with Nifty and in helping schools implement. And what he talks about is all the little things that can be involved, student schedules, when you have announcements that come over the intercom, the constant monitoring of student achievement and student growth. And the programs have very clear guidelines on doing that and keeping track of how students are doing. The regrouping of students frequently so that you're sure that kids are moving along at the pace they can. The kids who are zooming ahead aren't bored. The others are staying up and learning something new each day and making progress. So the instructional leadership is really, really important. And if I'm remembering that paper right, we had, I think, 4 different settings in which we could compare what was happening with the with the different settings. And there were things like training, making sure you have trained teachers. The fun thing about that, well, the fun thing from a methodological standpoint, is that most of the studies were experimental designs, natural experiments where an administrator had done something really awful. And we could compare what the situation was when it was awful to what it was when it was better. And yeah, and so it can be quite clear how things can change. And you are so right. Teachers can do a lot, but if they're in a setting where they don't have the support and they don't have the guidance, it can be very, very difficult and disheartening.
You said something in this paper that I told my wife this just the other day, and she chuckled because it was that in terms of implementation theory, or sort of a hypothesis, that if the program itself has been shown to be effective, like DI programs have 5 decades or more of research, then having really good implementation fidelity and strong leadership should boost those results. But then you said, so the other side of the coin should also be true, in which if you have a poor program that has a tiny effects on learning, or perhaps none, that if you implement them poorly, that maybe learning will go up. Because I thought that was hilarious.
Yes, that's true. Yes, yes. Yeah, and it's actually Zig Engelman who pointed that out to me. He's an incredibly smart man. Yeah, he's very, very logical. His college major was actually philosophy, and the logic part of philosophy, I think, always just was very, very central to his thinking.
And that I should ask that because, right, professors like know each other and talk to each other, and you're both at the University of Oregon. Was this was Zig Engelman someone that you talked to or that you knew before you kind of got into this work?
No, I didn't know him at all. Isn't that interesting? I think partly because he was spending a lot of time out in schools and we were sort of in different parts of the university. I did know Doug Carnine, and I did know some of the other people who were involved, but no, and yeah, and
And
it's too bad.
that sort of does challenge the feeling that, because I've shared this, a lot of your work with people, challenge it that you're like, like a DI, that you're not a teacher of DI or a practitioner, right? And also you're sort of not fully in the world of DI. You're looking at this from a different perspective, which I think is hugely invaluable.
I think that's really important. And it's also important to know that my three co-authors on this, the graduate students who came in, are also not in the world of education. So Caitlin and Christy are both from psychology and Tim is from history. And so we all come from empirical social science backgrounds. And I think that really helped us both be apart from this world, to be more objective, and then also to come from traditions that really rely on data and analysis to come to conclusions. So the fact that we were so insulated from that world, I think, is an advantage.
Perfect. Let's end on just a couple more questions. Because I have your ear, I wish we could talk about it, this forever. What are some areas for future DI research or research in schools that you would like to see kind of come about? And then what are you working on next, or what are you working on currently?
A lot of dissertations have been written on, does DEI work to teach first grade reading? I mean, it's sort of an easy dissertation to write. I don't think we need any more of those. I think that the answer is there. But I think there are things like, how can we help teachers implement better? And what can schools do to implement better? I think that's really important. I also think that some really nice work could be done on documenting the change in self-esteem and student confidence that happens as students become learn more and as they become better teachers, better students, or learning acquire more knowledge. And the same thing can happen with teachers. There's a little bit out there about teachers being more dedicated to the field and so on when they become when they use DI and when they become more skilled. And I think it would be really good to have more data there, because that it really does help teachers. Teachers really do feel more confident, more sure of themselves, and it's got to be fun for them to have their students learn. And then I think another area of research could be the opposition. And this might be something more for people in political science or one of the other social sciences to study. But why is there so much opposition that really is irrational in terms of those of us from the outside? And I think that could be a fascinating kind of study for somebody to pursue.
Love it. Yeah. And I, I sometimes wonder about the comparison between DI and some of these other programs. Like, why do you think, like, since we know that this is effective, why isn't it just the default that the control group would be a DI program? And then you could see, instead of comparing it to this, like, kind of like, what is the business as usual? It's not defined by the researchers. We say, this was exactly what we used as the control group. We gave this amount of implementation time. Like, why don't they do that? Or am I crazy to think that that would be a good idea?
Actually, that's a really, really good point. Because what one could do is, when instead of using an effect size of 0.25 as a comparison, say, no, let's use the one we know from the 50 years of research on DI. Let's use 0.53 as a comparison. Can you meet that? Can you be better than that? If you can, wow, that's wonderful. But yes, you have a wonderful idea there. I think you should write a paper about it. We need to change this criterion to reflect what could really happen. And this point, I believe it's 0.53 with the reading studies, and I forget what it is overall, the average with the math. And that's with every kind of implementation. It's with the bad ones, the good ones, and so on. And so That's a really cool idea. Yep, have that be the criterion. And the other thing related to this is that people have to realize that there are many kinds of research designs that are appropriate and valid. And there's sort of this love affair with randomized control trials, which don't make sense in field settings. And there's a ton of writing in the social science literature about this. And one thing is that everybody knows who's in the experimental and the control group. You don't have any kind of double blind thing. It's not like taking a medicine in a brown paper wrapper. Instead, everybody knows, oh, you're using that text, you're using this text, or even across schools. And we know that results are statistically valid and logically valid with other kinds of designs. And what we did in our study is we tested to see if there were differences across, and there aren't. So I think that we need to get beyond that.
Excellent. I'm going to be thinking about that a while because I feel like I've been one of those people that's glorified RCTs. So I'll be thinking about that.
Let me add one more thing to that if I can.
Yeah.
Okay, I have an article in the American Journal of Evaluation that talks about this over-reliance. And also, it was in the work on doing that, I was looking at the What Works Clearinghouse, which just has bizarre kinds of procedures. And I found out that when they first set up their procedures, all of the major research groups told them they were crazy and opposed it. And so the social science and evaluation community said, that is not the way you go. Because what they do is try to find like one perfect study. And that's totally contrary to the notion of accumulative science. And yeah, but they sort of, again, it's this sort of mindset, this sort of, and it's a hubris. It's the saying, we know what we're doing. We're so wonderful. And you just have to say, whoops, this emperor doesn't have any clothes.
That's great. So Jean, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think this is the chance to, you don't have to talk DI, but just to, this is a platform for you to say what you're working on next, like, and what you're doing sort of these days.
Oh, well, that's very nice. Yes. Actually, I'm working, finishing up a revision of a paper on generational inequalities. One of the most disturbing things that's happened in Western nations over the last 30 years is a decline in the well-being of younger people relative to older people. So that relative to older people, younger generations have more health problems, both physical and mental. They have more economic stress. They have higher rates of suicide than birth cohorts or generations from earlier times. And so in this project, I've analyzed suicide rates, which are possible to analyze. They're not, I was going to say nice to analyze. We're quantitative scientists, social scientists. They're handy because they're very standard from one country to another. We've all collected the data in the same way. So compared generational rates of suicide for cohorts, these are groups of people born from the 1870s through the early 2000s, and looked at the association of factors that can affect these. And also factors related to the circumstances in which they were born and the events they lived through in their formative years, because some events are clearly harder than others: economic depressions, wars, the COVID pandemic, the earlier 1918 pandemic. And one of the most interesting things I found, which I think is really relevant to this, is that the negative impacts of these experiences and characteristics can be moderated by social circumstances, so that they are they're muted within societies that provide more support. And this is a very strong finding. And this paper, I've extended the data set quite a bit, and it continues to hold up. We can make societies that are more supportive and more of young people. And in doing so, we can make a healthier society. And we just have to do that. It's in a way, it is a continuation of the work on DI, because I see that as saying, yes, these kids can learn. We can create schools in which students learn, in which teachers feel successful. And we can also do societies where the well-being of the young is guaranteed.
Well, with that, that's a perfect closing note. Jean Stockard, I really appreciate having you on the podcast. I wish the best of luck to you on these new projects. Thanks for coming on, and take care.
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, this is wonderful.
I'm here when you